Hello and welcome to the B3 Biennale of 2020. My name is Dan Sullivan and I work as a head of Next program at the Marché de Film of Festival de Cannes. But I'm also serving this year as a digital advisor to this quite special edition of the B3 that takes place virtually due to the global pandemic. Over the past days, we have been exploring, or over the past week, so to speak, we have been exploring all kinds of moving images from media art to games, to experiences and also films. And this year's topic, as you well know, is centering around the concept of truth. And obviously, what would be a more important moving image art form than documentary films, which is quite often investigating the truth or portraying or doing storytelling or building storytelling around truth or truths, as in plural. And today I have the great pleasure to have a conversation with Alexandre Philippe, who is a Swiss and United States-based filmmaker, a dear friend, an explorer of popular culture, and also the explorer of myth-making and storytelling in popular culture. So, good morning, Alexandre, and welcome to the B3.
Thanks. Good morning, Stan. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, the usual question, obviously, this year for a lot of our participants is you have been in the past few years you have been awfully busy in directing films, in producing films, and obviously also in the festival and masterclass circuit. I guess you are one of the few documentary filmmakers who, you know, in a row had films in Sundance and then Venice and all of the festivals, you know, before and after that, as well as, you know, especially if you think about last year with the recent film in Venice and Sundance, right? The Leap of Faith. We're going to talk about that, but what has happened to your life and to your work in these very strange and odd times?
Well, it's been really interesting, you know, because I mean, as you said, I'm very prolific, and I like to keep myself busy, and you know, the idea of not working on something certainly drives me crazy, you know. But I've been very, very fortunate that, you know, I'm working on 2 features right now, and in fact, before the global pandemic started, I started to experiment with the idea of working on films that would involve essentially audio interviews, so no talking heads. So which means that we wouldn't actually need to go and shoot those interviews, but you know, and then essentially, you know, we would use existing footage. So it turned out to be a blessing in a way. Well, I'm not saying that COVID is a blessing. It's not a blessing, but it's a blessing that I was working on those projects already when you know, when the pandemic hit, because in a way, you know, I think my work has not been as affected as other filmmakers who rely obviously on being you know, in production with actors or even documentary filmmakers who rely on actually filming things themselves. So you know, so I'm moving forward. It's still hard. It's hard to be on lockdown, but we're, you know, making the best of it.
So, you know, we're conversing today about the topics around pop culture, truth, you know, myth and forming of communities and these phenomena of pop culture. But, you know, let me sort of like rewind a good 20 years. You are originally from Switzerland. Some of your family is based around the epicenter of cinema, Cannes, if I may say. But you went to the United States and you went to Tisch, right? And after that, you started your career with documentary filmmaking, made a few films, and then came George Lucas and the phenomenon of Star Wars. And I just kind of want to start with there, for you to ask, as a documentary, well, first of all, what interests you in documentary? And secondly, you have carved a very specific, I would say, a focus or even niche, if I may say, for documentary films and making films about certain subjects. So could you a little bit talk about that?
Sure. I mean, well, first of all, I will start by saying that I don't really like the term documentary for some reason. I think part of that has to do with the fact that I think, and I think this is obviously irrelevant to the topic we're discussing, but I think the word documentary implies the dry, unvarnished truth. And I just don't think that it's that simple. And I think there's a stigma that comes, I think that quote unquote documentary filmmakers have had to deal with for a long time. I mean, if you talk about the general public, well, obviously documentary films don't do as well as fiction films usually, except for a few rare exceptions, because there is this concept that documentaries are just not going to be as entertaining or as fun because it's the truth, right? So first of all, I want to sort of debunk this idea that the truth is not entertaining. The truth, I mean, if we just look around, I mean, especially the past 4 years in the United States, oh my God. I mean, well, we've gone way beyond the point of entertainment. It's becoming really dangerous and sad and everything you want to think of. But I think what's interesting, it's a moment in time where pop culture has become, where I think the lines between pop culture and real life have been blurred.
Mm-hmm.
Have allowed Trump into our lives as a politician, which was something that The Simpsons actually predicted, many years ago. and it's, look, I'm not going to make.
Or think about Paul Verhoeven and RoboCop, right? And you are straight in Detroit, actually.
But obviously you can certainly make the argument that it has not gone so well, and I think that's but it's very interesting because obviously, as you said, I'm fascinated by pop culture, and I've been studying pop culture, and I've been making films about pop culture for 17 years now. And so this idea that we live in a world where the lines are blurred between pop culture and reality, and in fact between truth and fake news, this idea that facts are subjective is a very strange thing, and I really struggle with that because we are now in a culture where anything goes, where you can just spew out a bunch of lies, just flat out falsehoods. Obviously you've got people who believe that the earth is flat and who have conventions around that. But then you have to really start worrying about, not just as a nation, but as a world, like, where are we going here? If we don't rely on science, if we don't rely on just a basis of observation and, empirical observation, and then deduction and implementing steps that can be taken based on those observations, then I think we're lost as humans. So going back to documentary film, I think for me, the thing that I've been struggling with is that I think it's very important to make films, the films that I make, which I guess are considered documentaries, to make them as entertaining and as accessible as possible. And I think that, this, in terms of technique, this comes with not just the content, but the scripting, the editing, the pacing of the editing, the way that you're engaging an audience. And so what I like to say is, I'm not primarily a documentary filmmaker. I am primarily a storyteller. Because if you can engage an audience on the level of story, then you've got them, right? At that point, it becomes a responsibility from the storyteller to not, especially a documentary filmmaker, to not present flat-out falsehoods. It is to present a story that hopefully will want to make people go and find the truth for themselves. So it's so there's a lot of sort of ethical questions around that, but I will say though that I think sometimes to get to the truth you have to tamper with the truth.
So this is a very provocative statement, I have to say, but but if you look back into the history of documentary, right, then think about the films that Flaherty and his old school did in 1920s and 1930s, which had a certain type of an interpretation of truth, or I would even say a glorification of truth. And obviously we can talk about Leni Riefenstahl and her work, which from its political angle is definitely very controversial, and it's very hard to even great films, but if you put them into a certain type of historical political context, then that it's a very difficult material. And obviously John Ford, who we'll hopefully talk about later, and his work in the military and afterwards, and so forth. So why do you think the documentary field itself has been so much, it has its origins in storytelling, and I would say a kind of interpretation or even emotional storytelling. If you look back to even Siga Vertov, right, who probably is one of the greatest emotional storytellers and users of these tools. Why do you think right now that a documentary itself is so much associated with, I guess, facts, rather than enabling interpretation?
Well, I mean, I think obviously, another term that is used for documentary filmmaking is nonfiction filmmaking, which is what it is, right? But my goodness, if you really start looking at not just the history of documentary filmmaking, but also the how one can approach essentially things that happened, right? Let's just say that, because a lot of documentary films use archival footage, will base themselves on actual events, on actual facts, right? But there's so many ways that you can use those images, that those things that happened, and even twist them, if you want, into things that didn't happen, or make people say things that they didn't really say. I mean, if you're looking right now at the, something as silly as that Trump ad that came out when he's talking, when he's using a very specific soundbite. Well, not he, the people who are cutting the ad, from Dr. Fauci, who is the chief virologist in the U.S., to make it sound like he's essentially endorsing the way that Trump has been handling the pandemic. So, you're using his words, but you're but using those words completely out of context. And so the very idea that of truth is something that can crumble in a minute when you're making a documentary film. And it doesn't matter if I were to give a bin of footage, of historical footage, to 10 different documentary filmmakers and say, make me a film, I guarantee you that all those 10 films will be completely different, because they will choose to use the footage in different ways. So even though 100% of what you're watching may actually be factual, each one of those 10 films will give you a different spin on what happened, or a different story entirely. So what does that say then? Well, I mean, and that's a question that I wrestle with all the time. I mean, what it says is that at the end of the day, to think that you can, pretend to provide the truth, I think is a false statement to begin with. I think the only thing that we can do, whether we are documentary filmmakers, writers, or historians, is we should do the best that we can to provide and communicate our own personal truth and hope that it resonates. And, the thing that amuses me the most, probably, because it happens every single time that a film comes out, a big Hollywood movie that comes out about a historical figure, or, or a big, battle or something that actually happened, then the historians, of course, will come out and they'll be interviewed on and the first thing that they will say is, well, that's not the way it happened, And, I understand that they are armed with facts that, filmmakers probably don't have, that they've researched the topic a lot more than we have. I understand that. But at the end of the day, once again, first of all, I would say, well, were you there? Probably not. But secondly, if you were to read, and going back to what I was saying earlier, if you were to read 10 books by 10 historians on the same topic, they would focus on different things. They would be, in fact, contradictory pieces of information, because ultimately it's up to how those historical figures and those events resonated with them, how they ingested that, how they translated that, and how they decided to communicate that with an audience. So, are historians and documentary filmmakers really different in that sense? I'm not so sure. We're storytellers.
So I guess that kind of leads to really the question of a personal ethic of a filmmaker or a personal approach of a filmmaker. And I guess each filmmakers, and some of the filmmakers you have made films about have also had their own methods of extracting the truth. If you think about Billy Friedkin or Hitchcock or some others, and perhaps why not George Lucas, right?
Yeah.
But if you go and start researching a subject, what kind of captivates you? How do you choose your topic? How do you choose that phenomenon that you start investigating, or occasionally even dissecting in a very miniature detail?
I always say that I don't choose my subjects choose me. And it's very strange, actually. It almost feels like the next film is just something that sort of becomes evident, and I can never really remember when was the first time that I had the idea, when was the first time that I started really actively thinking about it becoming a film. It's just something that was sort of at the back of my brain, but that kept coming back again and again and again, to the point where eventually I have to confront those things that keep telling me I want to be a film. I want you to pay attention to me, in a way. It's kind of what I think those ideas are saying. And, The People versus George Lucas, for instance, was, for the longest time, it was a title before it was anything. When did that title first pop into my head? I could not tell you. I just know that I've had it for a long time. Mm-hmm. And one day I was on a shoot in Texas. Actually, it was a commercial shoot with my crew and Robert Muratori, our longtime director of photography at Exhibit A Pictures, who's also a Star Wars fan. We were having a conversation, and I just told him, I said, I've had this idea for a film. It's called The People versus George Lucas. And that's all I said. And he knew, as a Star Wars fan, when you say that, you know exactly what this means. And so he said, oh my God, he said, we have to do it. I will help you produce it. We'll figure out a way to do it. And this is how we essentially, then we met with Carrie Roy, and we created Exhibit A Pictures at the time. This is what really sort of started that company. It just happens. And Leap of Faith is another example where I was not planning at all on making a film on The Exorcist. I just happened to be at the Sitges Film Festival, having lunch with Gary Sherman at one of the 30 restaurants on the port. And Billy Friedkin happened to be 2 tables behind me and called me to his table because he was having lunch with the directors of the festival who, apparently they were talking about me, and he had heard a lot about my film and he wanted to see it. And then, he invited me in to have lunch in Los Angeles. It's just I feel a little bit like Forrest Gump sometimes, just stumbling through life and things just happen,
I'd say, okay, things happen. And the film what I a little bit want to start conversing about is about octopuses. And it's about, I would say, projections. And You made, one of the films after, or the film after People versus George Lucas. What you are, or we're primarily known of, is about Paul the Octopus. And yes, there has been evidence that octopuses are quite smart, but it was clear that during this time of the football craze, there were definitely a lot of projections and hopes evolving and colliding around subject matter. So let's see a clip, and then let's talk about Paul the Octopus.
Okay.
Hello, I'm David Spiegelhalter, and I'm here to talk to you about the mathematics of Paul the Psychic Octopus.
As an octopus goes, he's a fairly attractive version of one. Nice colouring, good legs.
Statistically speaking, he knows more than we think he knows. He'll go down in history as one of the greatest football tipsters ever.
And Bayes' theorem says that we multiply our initial odds that he's psychic by 600, and that gives us our final odds that he's psychic, given this evidence that he got 8 right.
Well, no, the possibility is there's more. The possibility is that this is beyond chance.
Despite the fact that our world doesn't like to accept the idea that the future is written, we're all desperately interested in what the future holds.
Everywhere, everybody wants a bit of Paul. I mean, this octopus is just a phenomenon.
Dímelo pulpo, dímelo pulpo, dímelo pulpo, pao. Dímelo pulpo, dímelo pulpo, dímelo pulpo, pao.
Okay, I've now got a connection with Paul.
Oh, why all of us over Paul the Psychic Octopus?
There's all sorts of animals claiming to be able to predict, but so far so good, they can't. We're the only ones.
Ladies and gentlemen,
it took Phil 125 years to be the prognosticator of prognosticators. And then we've got Paul, who would be our octopus friend. Is Phil going to, go head to head with him? At the end of the day, Phil just does weather.
Credo comunque che sia il polpo più internazionale della storia.
I think there should be a very large government budget put aside to fund the research, because it could have benefits for all mankind.
because
or it could all be bollocks.
It was really cool to see that. I had not seen that trailer in a long time, in many years. It's really fun to watch this again. It made me a little bit emotional, actually, about Paul. But the World Cup, I think it was it the 2010 World Cup? He became a huge phenomenon, obviously mostly in soccer playing countries. But I remember he was, front page of CNN, and he was all over the news in the United States. He was a phenomenon after 4 games because he had, I'm not going to use the word predicted, but he had picked the right muscle out of the right box 4 times in a row. And at the time, he was essentially, the whole idea was that he was predicting the games for Germany. Mm-hmm. And then one day he predicted that Germany would lose to Argentina, which of course created a huge uproar, and that happened. He became, they had to put the aquarium on lockdown because he was he lived in Oberhausen, Germany, and things became really dangerous, I think, for him. But at that point they had a choice to either retire him or keep going, and they decided that they were going to have him keep making his quote unquote predictions until the final. And I remember watching the final, which was Spain versus Netherlands, in Denver with Dave Kraling, my editor. And I told him, I said, and Paul had predicted that Spain would win. And I said, if Spain wins, we're making a film about Paul. Like, there's no question about it. And the rest is history, as they say.
Yeah, but I played this clip because within the phenomenon of Paul, and what you're also showing in the film is that these kinds of factual occurrences, right, or real life facts suddenly start evolving into projections and myths. And sorts of. So why do you think, now, as directing the film, but doing it also in a very kind of a pastiche or a joyous way?
Oh, sure.
Why do you think these hopes are being projected, and why these phenomena do materialize?
Well, in a strange way, this sort of relates actually to my latest film, Leap of Faith, in thematically, in the sense that, one of the things that Friedkin really talks about at length is the idea of faith and fate and the mysteries of life. He is a huge believer in the idea that we don't know anything. And I tend to believe that. And I think what is beautiful about life is the mysteries. It's not what we know, it's what we don't know. And I think that the more if you start thinking about the universe, if you start thinking about time, if you start thinking about, all these sort of cosmic questions, what do we know? We don't know anything. But that's what makes it so fascinating and beautiful. And I love the fact that when this octopus comes along and becomes the story of the World Cup, and I love the fact that, I interviewed, obviously, the very first person who shows up in the trailer is David Spiegelhalter, who is one of the, leading statistics experts in the world, who teaches at Cambridge University and who came up with this whole formula to basically, he came up with a formula, which is pretty complicated, but to see if we can prove one way or the other, was Paul just lucky, or was Paul truly a psychic octopus? And at the end of the day, there is no mathematical formula that can prove one way or the other whether Paul was a psychic or not. So he will tell you, he will say, as a mathematician, I believe that Paul was really lucky. I believe that his odds of getting 8 predictions correctly in a row was basically 1 out of 600, right? Now, you talk to the bookmakers, based on their experiences and based on the predictions that Paul made, they're like, no way. There has to be more than just luck, right? And so at the end of the day, what really fascinates me here is that there's something really cosmic and something really beautiful about the fact that we can't prove it one way or the other. We will never know. And I think we should just enjoy the fact that Paul came at this point in life to make us think about those things, because he made us think about really some pretty darn cosmic questions in a really entertaining sort of pop culture way. And I think we should always be grateful for that.
At the same time, we were talking about fate and faith, and we're going to get that in the latter part of our conversation. But at the same time, obviously, yes, these two kind of forces are at play, and the great unknown or the great other. But at the same time, quite often, filmmakers, especially, have a power to shape that collective imagination. And one of the filmmakers that you are, I would say, an ultimate expert on is Alfred Hitchcock, right? And your film 7852 took that kind of one very specific moment of Hitchcock, the infamous shower scene, which went to define what a genre or a horror film genre, or even a kind of a public imagination how it was shaped, right?
I once made a movie. It was intended to cause people to scream and yell, but I was horrified to find that some people took it seriously.
It was actually the first time in the history of movies where it wasn't safe to be in the movie theater.
When a moment of violence is so suggestive, so unlike anything we've seen, murder was now going to be an acceptable part of entertainment.
Psycho you felt could happen to you. This was the first movie that showed you can be naked, alone in a shower, and someone who is going to come in and just stab you.
It had to be done impressionistically. The head, the feet, a hand.
He has broken the covenant of filmmaker and audience, and the audience cannot wait to see more.
Well, I think 1752 for me, it probably is still, I think, the most sort of important film that I've made in terms of my career to date, in the sense that I think it really, it began a new movement, I guess, of films. I was very sort of heavily into pop culture, but also film. But I think 1752 became, started having more of a cinephile kind of, feel to it. It's still dealing, obviously, not just with pop culture, but also with a cultural moment, and I'm very interested in those moments in cinema, like the shower scene, like the chestburster scene, like The Exorcist, like, Star Wars and the impact. I mean, those are not just movies, those are cultural moments. And I think that when those films become such huge cultural moments, it's very, very important to pay attention to them and to not just say, oh, yeah, they're important films. Yeah, they're, here are some behind the scenes stories. I want to dig as deep as I can and try to understand why they were such important cultural moments. Because at the end of the day, I think pop culture is a mirror to our society, and if we try to understand why we respond to certain things more than others, then we start, I think, understanding ourselves a little bit more. But so to answer your question, I mean, there was really not a time, I think, in my life when I don't remember Hitchcock being a part of it. My dad was, my early sort of childhood memories was my dad was watching Hitchcock movies. He was watching Columbo, and he was watching Starsky and Hutch. So those were, the things that I was raised on. And so I couldn't tell you the first time that I watched Psycho. I couldn't tell you the first time that I watched Vertigo or any of the great films. I feel like they've always been around, and I feel like as a kid, I had watched them multiple times. And so the idea of making a film about Hitchcock, I think, was something that, not necessarily consciously, but that was always something that I wanted to do. And again, when did the idea, I mean, look, I have a proposal. I have my very first, sort of like proposal for a film about the shower scene that I started working on. But how did the idea come to me? It just, I have no idea. It was an evidence that it needed to be done. Just pretty much like every single one of my films.
But what in your mind was the sort of secret source of Hitchcock really in kind of altering the subconscious? I mean, that, and not to go into the spoilers of the film, if you haven't seen it,
yeah.
It's been widely on the festival circuit and available as well. And besides the fact that it does have an amazing number of cuts in there, what in your opinion, what was the mastery of Hitchcock, or what was the intent to shape the collective psyche or the collective subconscious in such a powerful way?
Well, I mean, we could be talking about this for days and not even scratch the surface. But I will say a couple of things. I will say that I think Hitchcock was, well, and strangely enough, I think that's the reason why he was not taken as seriously as he should have been during his lifetime, is that he was very entertaining, you know. But he was a combination between, I would say, P.T. Barnum and Houdini. He was this sort of perfect blend of the two. You know, he was the consummate entertainer, and he was an absolute screen magician who was, you know, immersed in technique and thought about cinema and about how to create, how to trigger emotions. You know, I think we often, you know, dismiss melodrama as being unimportant or beneath drama or whatever. Melodrama, I mean, you look at Vertigo, which is, I think, my favorite movie of all time, which I will argue is probably the greatest movie ever made. I know a lot of people will disagree with me on that, but that's okay. You know, Vertigo is a complete melodrama, you know, and it's an absolute masterstroke of filmmaking on every level. So, you know, but to make the shower scene work in the way that it did, I don't think that Hitchcock knew that it would become this sort of probably, you know, the most important 2 minutes in the history of movies. I think there is evidence that he saw an opportunity to create you know, his ultimate trick. And, you know, the evidence is when, you know, if you listen to the recordings between Hitchcock and Truffaut, and Truffaut actually asked him point blank, why did you want to make Psycho? What interested you in the Robert Bloch novella? And there's this almost like a 10-second pause. And then Hitchcock says, the murder in the bathtub coming out of the blue, that was about all. And that's incredible to me. And this is classic Hitchcock, by the way, in the way that he approaches story. And then I went, of course, spent a lot of time at the Margaret Herrick Library in Los Angeles, which is the Academy Library, which, you know, they have extraordinary sort of collections on you know, from Hollywood history. And they do have the entire sort of Psycho, you know, all the original papers and screenplays and sketches by Hitchcock and all this stuff, which you can hold, by the way, in your bare hands. And it's like, it's an overwhelming feeling. But I was holding this, there was this sheet of notes from Hitchcock, this probably one of the very early sort of outlines of Psycho, sequence by sequence, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just like a line per sequence, written in ink, right? And then at the bottom of the first page, it was only like 2 pages, but at the bottom of the first page was maybe sequence, whatever, 8 or 9 or whatever. It says, in all caps, the murder. And so, you know, it's so amazing that he had not even figured out how he was going to approach it. And then when you read the different drafts of the screenplay by Joe Stefano, chronologically, it says the murder, the first one. And then there's a short paragraph that describes it. And then the paragraph becomes 2 paragraphs, and it becomes half a page, and it becomes a page and a half. And so you can see the wheels, not obviously of Joe Stefano, but also of Hitchcock, turning in terms of like, okay, this is how we're going to approach it. And then you watch, of course, the extraordinary storyboards by Saul Bass, and you know, and then everything had to happen. Everything had to happen right. You know, the way that it was shot, the number of cuts, the extraordinary editing of the scene. I mean, especially at a time when, you know, you had to physically cut. You know, like, and then, you know. He was looking at the scene, and, you know, an early cut, and he was there with Bernard Herrmann, and it, you know, he wanted no music initially, and it didn't work. And Herrmann came in and said, "Look, why don't you go take your Christmas vacation? I'm gonna take that scene and I'm gonna play with it. I have an idea."
Well, and the rest is history, right?
And the rest is history. So you have to have all of those ingredients. I mean, it's not just one thing. It was, of course, it was Hitchcock at the very top of his game, but it was this confluence, and also the confluence of when that movie came out, you know, in 1960. We can talk also about the fact that, you know, why did Psycho become a huge success, and why did Peeping Tom, which came out a couple of months earlier, flop? And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that there was Hitchcock behind it, that Hitchcock was our sort of like, the creepy uncle that we like to go visit every now and then, even, that we knew that he was a prankster, that he would pull something on us. Mm-hmm. Peeping Tom was much more just profoundly creepy. And there wasn't that sort of connection, I think, with Powell from the audience. So I think those are the differences. But I think what it tells you too is that I think to really, that the filmmaker himself in this case, his personality, I think had very much something to do with why audiences couldn't get enough of Psycho, and once they walked out of the theater, they wanted to go back in to experience that thrill again.
Yes, the great myth maker. This leads us to your latest work, which we touched upon briefly before, The Leap of Faith. And I guess I hope you might agree that with that film you also you yourself took quite a big leap of faith, because you went to explore a huge myth, a massive myth, I guess even a subconscious fear of The Exorcist. This is a film, or this is a book, this is a film. I guess that is almost a subconscious myth. I don't know anybody, of our age at least, who doesn't have a certain type of a relationship to that film, and also. It's a very fascinating subject because it's a film, and it's a production that is surrounded in such a myth from its inception.
This is Bill Friedkin, day one, take one. Everything has to do with the mystery of fate or faith. And The Exorcist is about the mystery of faith. I knew exactly how I wanted to make it. I marked up my own copy of the hardcover. I didn't want any backstory, no flashbacks. Just a straight-ahead story that was done as realistically as possible. Over the decades, it's been interpreted and reinterpreted. Many people look at the ending of the film as ambiguous. Doesn't appear to have been a problem for the millions of people who've seen the film. They accept what we showed. It asks for a total leap of faith on the part of the audience.
What is quite fascinating is that during the course of that fate or that happy accident where you met Billy Friedkin in Sitges, you started developing really a very interesting relationship. And what kind of strikes me with the film is that the film has a very, very unique approach. And when I saw it personally, the film is not exactly what I would imagine it to be.
Sure.
I guess it is a personal exploration. So tell us, how did you went to explore this, almost the myth of myth, in at least in genre cinema and in pop culture related to genre?
Well, so when we had lunch, when he invited me to have lunch in Los Angeles, initially I actually saw it as because he had actually turned me down for 1752. I wanted to interview him for that film, and he had said no. And so I was actually excited to meet him because I thought it was an opportunity for me to interview him for Memory, which the film about Alien, which is essentially a mythological film about Alien, which I was working on at the time. But strangely enough, he didn't respond when I asked him about that. He sort of dodged the question and immediately turned the topic to The Exorcist. And and then he started telling me about his archives and the things that he has that people have never seen, and then he sort of casually said, if you wanted to have access, I'd give you access. Like, what do you mean? And he said, well, he said, why don't you read my autobiography, and if you find an angle, just let me know. And so, of course, that's the first thing I did immediately was get the book, and it's, Friedkin Connection. It's an amazing book, highly, highly recommended. There's also an audiobook version of it, which I hear is great because he is such a great storyteller, obviously. So to me, when I started reading the book, the first thing that came to mind was I knew I wanted to do a deep dive into The Exorcist. Essentially, and really, quite frankly, an unprecedented deep dive into The Exorcist, but completely from the perspective of Friedkin. I didn't want to talk about special effects. I didn't want to revisit the kind of stuff that, had been well documented and was well known. And, there's a lot of stuff around behind the scenes stories and all of that. But I saw an opportunity, and in fact, I told him, I sent him an email, and I said I would like to actually use the Hitchcock-Truffaut model of interviews. But instead of chronologically going through your entire career, I would like to focus exclusively on The Exorcist and completely crack it open, sequence by sequence, scene by scene, technique by technique, get into your philosophy and your thinking and all of that, and structure it essentially into a series of interviews, which we would do over a number of days. And so he immediately said, this sounds really great and ambitious. Let's do it. How many days do you need? So we started with 3 days, and then it became 4, and then it became 5, and then it became 6. And so, and not to count all the, the numerous lunches and phone calls and all the stuff in between, but that's how I approached it. And then the way that I prepared for it was I went to this just gorgeous vineyard in Sebastopol, California, which is just a few miles from Bodega, where Hitchcock shot The Birds. And I wanted to actually find this sort of idyllic, beautiful place to counterbalance the intensity of The Exorcist. And I took The Exorcist with me. My desk had a view on a vineyard. It was just beautiful. And so my routine every day was I would wake up at 5:30 in the morning, drive through the fog, by the Potter School, where the very famous scene from The Birds was shot. I would sort of tip my hat to Hitchcock, go on the beach for a long hour and a half walk, get my coffee, go back to the Airbnb, and watch The Exorcist. And I did that for 30 days straight. And every day I would start taking notes, and that's how I sort of started essentially building my, the structure that I have in mind, building, putting together my interview sessions and, by themes and all of that. And but it was intense. I mean, watching The Exorcist 30 days in a row is not something that that I would recommend.
But it's interesting, and correct me here. What I found in that film and what I found in that conversation was sort of two aspects, right? I found it very fascinating of exploring the side of Billy Friedkin as a very deliberate myth maker. And in a way, a very self-conscious master of the universe, if I may, right? A perfectionist that that goes to explore a certain subject matter and then uses every tool literally possible, right? Both in terms of manipulation of and extraction of emotion. There are famous stories of him slapping people on sets and creating certain types of conditions, in hospitals and what if not, right? But at the same time, I also so it felt for me that in a way he was very clear and very conscious about of creating a certain type of a myth or elevating that subject matter into yes, into a pop phenomenon. At the same time, what really struck me about the film that I have to confess that I haven't really seen Exorcist from that lens, which ultimately is really about the kind of the human psyche or the human conditions versus the great unknown, and ultimately the great unknown of the cosmos, the great unknown of religion, and obviously in very many sense of a person's relationship to faith, but at the same time also a family's tragedy of coping of dissolution of a family and coping with the trauma, right? And I think these kinds of themes, at least in exploring the Exorcist, have been never very much prevalent in the pop culture.
Well, and that's why The Exorcist resonates pretty much with everybody, and it doesn't matter if you're a person of faith, and it doesn't matter what your faith is. It doesn't matter if you're agnostic, if you're atheist. I mean, it is a film ultimately about the mysteries, and it's a film about love. So it is such an emotional experience, and the special effects, it sort of bugs me in a way that usually the first thing that people talk about when they talk about The Exorcist is, the head turning or the green oatmeal or, all of that stuff. And to me, that couldn't be, to me, that's the least important stuff about The Exorcist. And I think that the least important part of William Friedkin's sort of real artistry in that, and this is why really in Leap of Faith I wanted to focus on his relationship to art, his relationship to music, without giving it away. Obviously, the whole, there's a very important scene in Leap of Faith about Kyoto and what William Friedkin calls, grace notes, which is the kind of stuff that I think once you start really understanding his philosophy as a person, not just as a filmmaker, but as a person, you can start really, I think, appreciating The Exorcist on a different, more profound level. But I think The Exorcist is a very profound experience as a film. Now, you mentioned the Friedkin slapping actors and doing things that directors would not be allowed to do today and probably wouldn't do anymore. If you don't mind, I would love to read a quote actually that I have from him.
Please.
I think that's really something that's very interesting, and it goes back to this thing that I said earlier, that sometimes you have to bend the truth in order to get to the truth. And Friedkin did it in his own way. So I'm just going to read to you something that he said to me. And he said, actually, this is also in relationship to one of his very, very first films, because, Friedkin was actually a documentary filmmaker. And he made a film called The People versus Paul Crump about this man who was on death row, and actually he saved his life. But so this is what he said. He said, Father Dyer gives Father Karras the last rites by holding his hand as he's dying. He has to come to tears, and he couldn't do it. The really good actors can produce the emotion. We tried umpteen takes, and finally I tried what I had only tried one other time before that. I called him aside. I told Owen Roisman and Ricky Bravo to just roll the camera and don't cut. And I took O'Malley aside and I said, Bill, do you love me? He said, yes, of course I love you, Bill. You know that. I said, do you trust me? He said, of course, I trust you. I said, okay. And then I turned away and then I hit him full in the face. I smacked him in the face and I pushed him in front of the camera and I said, action. And he did it and burst into tears. And after that, he hugged me and thanked me because there was no other way he was going to get to that. The only other time I had done that before was when I was making a documentary about this guy who was going to the electric chair. My first real documentary film in Chicago. The film saved his life. But when he had told me the story of how the Chicago police had beaten a confession out of him, he burst into tears while he was describing what they did to him. Then, when I went to film it for the documentary, he couldn't get to tears, There's cameras and stuff. It wasn't the same thing as sitting one-on-one with another person. So when he told the story again, when I asked him to tell it for the camera, it was rather passionless, but I wanted tears. And I remembered this thing that Ford and Stevens had done. This guy had been on death row for 9 years. It's where I filmed him, in his cell on death row at Cook County Jail in Chicago. Before I had him say it again, I smacked him in the face, and he burst into tears. So, you know, we could probably have a whole masterclass with a bunch of documentary filmmakers, right? Especially today, on the ethics of that approach to documentary filmmaking. But there's something really amazing here in a way, and that I can't help but respect. I mean, like, I've obviously an immense amount of respect for Friedkin. I mean, he has given me lessons in filmmaking and in life that I will carry for the rest of my life, right? But this is really interesting because the truth, he had that moment of truth from Crump when the cameras were off. And to take that step, you know, to smack him in the face, to get back to that truth which he knew he couldn't get to again, it's a remarkable step, I think. And I you know, it saved his life. So.
And it feels for me that it's also a remarkable step on behalf of the filmmaker to assume agency and to assume responsibility also.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, you know. But again, it's not the kind of stuff that one could do today. and he recognizes that, you know, But I think it also makes his films that much more important in a way, because you're looking at, I mean, some of the stuff that he was doing, you know, shooting guns on the set and slapping actors and, you know, almost broke.
And drawing blood.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like this sort of Wild West of Hollywood, you know, movie making that is long gone now. But I think looking back on those techniques and how they were achieved, it's fascinating. I mean, those are, you know, we should be really grateful that we have those films.
Our time today for the conversation is drawing to an end, and you touched the subject of Wild West. As we had a conversation before, you are now, and what could be a better time to do that, you're dwelling into the great American myth making, where cinema and filmmakers went to define what generations started to think about the foundations of America, the making of the West. What are you working on now?
Well, one of the films I'm working on is called The Valley. At least that's the title right now. We'll see if it changes. But it is really an observation or a sort of a deep dive into the way that Monument Valley was used in films, specifically in the films of John Ford, and how they essentially sort of became came to embody the myth of the West. You know, it's very interesting that, I mean, especially for me coming from Switzerland, and, you know, I mean, I was in my 20s when I went to Monument Valley for the first time. But, you know, watching the Westerns and dreaming about America and dreaming about the West and Hollywood and all of that. But, you know, when you think about Monument Valley, these images of Monument Valley that we watch, they are completely connected in our brains, I think, with the idea of the West, and therefore with an idea of America that is not, you know, that is not the only idea of America, but is not only even the truthful idea of, you know, America. I mean, Monument Valley is a very difficult, it's a really tough place. It's a place that has a long history with the Navajo. It is so brutal to live there that only about 200 people live there. You know, so there is a truth about Monument Valley that obviously is not the kind of stuff that you see in those Westerns, right? But I think, and so I'm very interested in this idea of to what extent those images, you know, the icons, inform our sense of the truth. And especially in this age of fake news, you know, looking back at those old Westerns and the John Ford ones, you know, can we argue that those were the fake news of the day? And once again, because it's fake news, does that mean that we should dismiss it? No, there is a value to myth. There is a value to, and there's a distinct difference between myth and lie. Myth is about storytelling, and it's about creating a narrative for our lives. We all need something like this. I mean, if you live just in the mystery and the ruthlessness of the universe and the idea that we don't mean anything, like how can we survive with that? We need meaning to our lives. And so we need a narrative. We need to find our narratives within that sort of cosmic reality, which is overwhelming. And so that's what this film is going to be about,
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Alexandre, for joining me to this really great exploration on documentary, great filmmakers and truth. We very much hope to see you back in the B3 Biennale in 2021, when we can travel again. And obviously the best of luck to exploring the great American myth. Thank you.
Thank you.